In the ancient world, especially within the Hellenistic matrix from which early Christianity emerged, language was never purely functional. Letters were not just phonetic markers. They were vehicles of form, bridges between sound and number, name and essence. Sacred names were not only identifiers, they were understood as operative formulae, revealing something of the divine being they signified. Over time, certain names accumulated layers of significance not because interpreters imposed systems upon them from outside, but because people observed consistencies, correlations and patterns, and then began to formalize those observations into symbols and words. In this light, Gematria was not the origin of meaning, but a response to it. Long before the formalization of numerical decoding systems, people recognized that names had power, that certain combinations of letters resonated with cosmological or theological significance, and that linguistic form itself seemed to participate in deeper patterns. As these observations accumulated, symbolic associations were attached to letters, not arbitrarily, but to reflect their perceived roles within larger structures. The association of a letter with a number, or a syllable with an archetype, emerged not as abstract invention, but as codification of meaning already intuited. The name IESOUS, the source of the English name Jesus, emerged within this context. This Greek name is considered a transliteration of the Aramaic to Hebrew name Yeshua, itself a shortened or contracted form of Yehoshua. Yehoshua means Yahweh is salvation, while the shorter Yeshua can be rendered as He will save, emphasizing the act of deliverance. Representing the convergence of transliteration, adaptation, and sacred innovation, its form took shape in a world already rich with symbolic thinking, where the resonance of names was felt before it was explained. As interpretive tools like Gematria became more systematic, they naturally encoded meanings already embedded in the linguistic and symbolic environment. The name, in other words, became readable through the very systems that had evolved to interpret names like it. Its structure and significance are not late overlays, but reflections of the same spiritual grammar that gave rise to those systems in the first place. The thesis of this work is not that Gematria or any other numerical interpretive system caused the meaning of the name, nor that such systems existed in a complete form before the name itself emerged. Rather, the claim is that the name and the symbolic systems it participates in co-evolved, emerging within a shared field of religious consciousness that increasingly demanded tools for interpreting patterns of meaning already sensed to be present. The process is mutual and recursive. Symbolic language gives rise to interpretive systems, which in turn refine our perception of symbolic language. Over centuries, this dynamic allows a name like IESOUS to become a convergence point, not just for linguistic history or theological doctrine, but for the whole complex movement of insight, transformation, and integration as it is enacted through sacred language. In such a framework, interpretive methods do not impose meaning, they reveal it, bringing to the surface what was always latent in the name's form. With that in mind, we approach the deeper structures of the Christian mysteries, understanding that these mysteries were never meant to be confined to literal belief, symbolic speculation, or doctrinal finality. Rather, they unfold across multiple layers of meaning, each revealing a deeper logic of divine reality as the capacity of the soul expands. In this method, we distinguish three interlocking levels of interpretation: the exoteric narrative level, the esoteric symbolic, or semantic level, and the hidden structural, or syntactic level. These are not arbitrary categories, but necessary dimensions of any revealed tradition that claims to unite finite and infinite, matter and spirit, temporal and eternal. Each level discloses a different kind of truth, and the Christian tradition remains incomplete if any one of them is absolutized or neglected. The exoteric level forms the public face of Christianity, its sacred story, its doctrinal affirmations, and its ethical teachings. It speaks in the language of history. Jesus of Nazareth lived, taught, was crucified, and rose from the dead. It also speaks in the language of law and covenant: love God, love neighbor, repent, be saved. This level is not merely for beginners, it is the grounding of the tradition in the concrete, the moral, and the linear. It establishes Christianity as a historical religion, and a personal path. Yet by its nature, the exoteric level is limited. It can only tell us what happened, not why the event bears inexhaustible significance across time, space, and consciousness. The exoteric level describes what the Logos did, but it does not yet reveal what the Logos is. When the mysteries are treated solely at this level, they devolve either into literalism, where symbolism is dismissed as dangerous, or into moralism, where salvation is reduced to behavior modification. While the exoteric level is indispensable for anchoring tradition, it cannot generate insight beyond the immediate context of the narrative. It is the shell that protects the seed, but not the seed itself. The esoteric level begins where the literal leaves off. Here, narrative becomes image, and image becomes sign. The cross is no longer only an instrument of execution, it becomes a universal symbol of opposites meeting, of vertical and horizontal planes intersecting, of death transformed into life. Christ is not only a man, but the Logos manifest in flesh, the archetype of the divine descending into matter and returning it to unity. At this level, parables, rituals, and events are read not merely as moral lessons, but as maps of the inner world, expressions of cosmic law, or reflections of metaphysical principles. This level is semantic in nature. It trades in meaning, resonance, and correspondence. The same image, say the baptism in the Jordan, may simultaneously signify historical initiation, spiritual purification, cosmic alignment, and psychological integration. The fathers of the Church understood this level when they read the Old Testament typologically, seeing Christ in Adam, Mary in Eve, the cross in the wood of Noah's Ark. Later mystics and esoteric traditions expanded this method into a symbolic science, reading scripture as a network of living correspondences. But this level too has its limitations. Symbolism without structure becomes subjective, speculative, or purely aesthetic. The reader becomes unmoored, interpreting texts based on internal projection rather than any coherent framework. Without a deeper grounding, symbolic interpretation loses its authority. It can express but not verify. It can illuminate but not constrain. The structural level moves beyond story and symbol to the architecture of meaning itself. It asks not just what an image signifies, but what must be true for the symbol to function. This is the level of triadic logic, numerical structure, transformational syntax, and metaphysical invariance. Here we are no longer asking, what happened? Or even, what does this represent? But rather, what is the governing form that makes this possible at all? At this level, the mysteries are seen as grammars, not of speech, but of reality. The name IESOUS, for instance, is not merely a label or even a cipher of symbolic identity. It is a syntactic object, a structure of interlocking triads, numerical resonances, and logical dynamics. Patterns such as descent, death, and return, or initiation, transformation, and reintegration, are no longer interpretive overlays. They are formative laws embedded in the tradition itself. They recur not because they are useful tropes, but because they reflect the underlying logic of how spirit engages with matter, or how the one refracts into multiplicity and returns again. The syntactic level is hidden, not because it is deliberately concealed, but because it requires a shift in cognition. It cannot be accessed through piety alone, nor by imagination, but only through a disciplined engagement with structure, with number, with logic, with necessity. At this level, Christ is not simply a redeemer, nor even a symbol of divine humanity. Christ is the form of the solution to a universal equation, the harmonization of opposites within time and being. Salvation is not only a rescue, it is a resolution. Each level of meaning reveals what the previous one cannot. The exoteric narrative anchors the tradition in time and community. The esoteric symbolic opens its significance to the soul and cosmos. The hidden structural reveals its formality, its universal grammar. All three are required. The literal alone breeds rigidity. The symbolic alone breeds relativism. The structural alone breeds abstraction. But together, they form a ladder of ascent and descent. a Jacob's ladder of interpretive vision. Christianity, properly understood, is not one of these levels, but the interplay of all three. The gospel is not only a message, but a symbolic code. And that code is written in a grammar of transformation which, once known, enables one to see that every mystery reveals not just a meaning, but a logic of being. This is the method by which the Christian mysteries must be approached, not in fragments, but in levels, and not arbitrarily, but in the order they themselves reveal. From here, we may now begin to explore the deeper syntactic systems embedded in sacred names, numbers and triads, not as speculative devices, but as the structural foundations of the mystery itself. Before turning to the affirmed triads themselves, it is necessary to clarify the numerical foundation and interpretive method that underlies everything that follows. The analysis of the name IESOUS begins with Greek Gematria, an ancient practice in which letters are also numbers, allowing words and names to be read not only linguistically or symbolically, but structurally. In this approach, numbers are not treated as decorative correspondences. They function as indicators of role, process, and constraint within a system. Each letter in the name IESOUS contributes not only to the numerical structure of the name, but also carries symbolic weight through its traditional associations in Greek thought and esoteric interpretation. Iota, I, the smallest letter, symbolizes the point, the spark of origin, or the seed of the logos. It is associated with unity and latent potential, the divine monad expressed in miniature. Eta, E, though phonetically an E, is symbolically linked to life and spirit, often connected to vitality, breath, or the animating force of the soul. It also carries a numerical value of 8, resonating with ideas of regeneration and eternal return. Sigma, S, is the symbol of summation and totality. It carries the sense of enclosing wisdom, and its serpentine shape echoes associations with Sophia, the serpent of knowledge, and the cyclical nature of time and return. Omicron, O, represents the bounded circle of creation, form within limitation, the world as container. Upsilon, U, is a forked letter, evoking the image of a branching path or a chalice. It traditionally symbolizes choice, sacrifice, and the crossing of spirit and matter. It was also used in early Christian texts to denote the shape of the cross. Finally, Sigma, S, closes the name again, reinforcing the theme of enclosure, completion, and recurrence. Together, these letters create a sequence that moves from singular origin through vitality, wisdom, embodiment, decision, and return, encoding the whole movement of incarnation and restoration within the form of the name itself. This work does not claim that there is a single, final, or objectively correct numerical decoding of the name Iesus. Rather, it argues that the name was intentionally chosen and shaped to function across three distinct but interrelated interpretive regimes: the symbolic, the structural, and the narrative. These regimes are not simply perspectives applied to the name, they are dimensions through which the name teaches, reveals, and transforms. The transition between them is not incidental, it is pedagogical and initiatory. The name is not merely about meaning, it is structured to train the reader to move through meaning. Under this view, the numbers derived from the name are not treated uniformly because they serve different roles at different levels of meaning. The triad IES, whose gematria yields 218, is reduced to 11, and then to 2. These reductions are read symbolically, not because their meaning is subjective, but because symbolic number reading is already a lived capacity of the esoteric initiate. These numbers do not demand analysis, but provoke recognition. 11 signals triadic structure, 2 signals polarity. This is the first movement, a gesture of insight, of seeing the structure of difference that underlies all understanding. The second structure is the triad OUS, OIS, whose numerical value is 670. Unlike the first triad, this number is not reduced arithmetically but read sequentially, as a process rather than a state. It is interpreted as 6, then 7, then 0. Here, 6 represents order, balance, and stable form. 7 represents disruption, transcendence, or the breaking open of that form. And 0 represents dissolution into the undefined, the void from which renewal becomes possible. This sequence defines the reacting factor. It is the logic of transformation itself, the movement through crisis, surrender, and release that must occur once duality is encountered. Where the initiating factor reveals structure, the reacting factor enacts change. The total of the name, 888, is read narratively and theologically. It is not reduced further because it is complete in itself, not as a number to be solved, but as a symbol to be inhabited. It denotes fullness, balance, and regeneration, the presence of the Logos. Here the name returns to the realm of lived meaning, not the beginning of understanding, nor the machinery of transformation, but the end state, coherence, harmony, resurrection. This is the third movement, the re-entry into wholeness, where number becomes presence and language becomes integration. Thus, the method used throughout this work is not inconsistent, it is triadic. It mirrors the very structure the name encodes. It moves from symbol to grammar to return to story, from insight to process to coherence. The insistence that one interpretive regime must govern the entire reading is not only limiting, it is a structural error. The name refuses to be read in one dimension, because initiation requires movement between dimensions. That movement is the teaching. Once we understand the Christian mysteries as operating on structural levels, we are equipped to explore the internal logic that governs their unfolding. These are not merely symbolic patterns imposed on scripture or doctrine. They are generative forms, logical architectures within which meaning arises, coheres, and returns to its source. The most fundamental of these structures are the affirmed triads. 11 relational models that describe how parts of a system interact, reinforce, contain, or complete one another. These are not mathematical abstractions. They are metaphysical principles woven into every layer of the Christian mystery, from the Trinity to the Incarnation, from the structure of parables to the form of transformation itself. Each triad describes a distinct kind of relationship between three interdependent elements, often corresponding to the initiating, reacting, and moderating aspects we have discussed in relation to the name IESOUS. These triads do not compete with each other. They describe different dimensions of the same mystery, each revealing how divine life integrates opposition, difference, and multiplicity into wholeness. In the coexistence triad, all three elements, initiating, reacting, and moderating, stand in mutual interdependence. Each is present with and through the others, not merely linked, but simultaneously necessary. This is the logic of harmony through differentiation, a reflection of the perichoresis of the Trinity. Here, the initiating factor, 218 reducing to 11 and 2, is the recognition of structure and polarity. 11 signifies the logical totality of possible triadic systems, the complete grammar of affirmation and negation, while 2 signifies the necessity of contrast for any form of knowledge. This foundational duality allows differentiation without separation. The reacting factor, 670 as 670, describes a temporal process. 6 is the stable order of the created world, 7 is the moment of transcendent movement or disruption, and 0 is the release or dissolution into the infinite. It represents the soul's transformation through and beyond form. The moderating factor, 888, is the fully harmonized system, spiritual fullness, balance, and regenerative perfection. It is the Logos not in becoming, but in being. In coexistence, each function implies and sustains the others. Without 2, duality, 6, 7, 0 has no ground to act on. Without transformation, duality becomes static. Without 888, the cycle has no closure. Each is necessary, not as a step in time, but as a simultaneous dimension of the whole. This triad affirms the Christian mystery as a co-presence of clarity, transformation, and completion, none subordinate to the others, all held together. Reinforcement describes a spiraling motion of intensification. Each component leads into the next, which then empowers the one that follows, forming a loop of ascent. This triad is the energetic circuit of growth, transformation, and integration. In this logic, The initiating factor, 11 and 2, is the beginning of vision. 11, as the master number of revelation, marks the entry into triadic logic, the first step beyond dualistic thinking, while 2 still governs the contrast through which that logic is revealed. Insight into duality opens the field of engagement. The reacting factor, 6, 7, 0, is the necessary unfolding. 6 as structure, 7 as disruption, and 0 as the void. In reinforcement, this sequence doesn't destroy, it propels. Transformation here is not collapse, but metamorphosis. What is initiated in insight becomes embodied through passage. The moderating factor, 8T8, now becomes elevated fulfillment. It does not just close the loop, it amplifies it. As 888, it reflects not only infinite return, but triple magnification. The regeneration of body, first 8, soul, second 8, and spirit, third 8. Thus, the system forms a living cycle. Insight, 11 and 2, gives rise to transformation, 6, 7, 0, which regenerates and empowers a higher form of being, 888, which in turn sharpens and deepens the original insight. It is the logic of spiritual ascent, mirrored in liturgy, sacrament, and inner gnosis. The causal triad expresses linear generation. Each component arises from the previous as effect from cause. This is the logic of incarnation, history, and cosmic unfolding. The movement from the seed of intention through the crucible of process into realized form. Here, the initiating factor is the origin. The dual nature of 2 is prominent. The knowledge of opposition, self and other, light and dark. But 11 here is potential, not yet realized, the unseen grammar. Together, they serve as the archetypal impulse behind manifestation. The reacting factor, 670 as 670, is the actual process of becoming. The initial order, 6, is disrupted, 7, leading through the 0 point of dissolution. This represents the crossing from potential to actual, from idea to embodiment, from divine into flesh. It is the suffering and the transmutation of all that resists unity. The moderating factor, 888, becomes the result. A perfected, balanced being in whom both the original vision and the process of suffering are integrated. In Christian theology, this triad is manifest in the logic of the incarnation. Divine word, initiating, enters the world, reacting, suffers, and dies, 0, and is resurrected in glorified form, 828. This structure affirms that what begins as insight into polarity must pass through experience before it becomes embodied harmony. It warns against expecting the fruit of the Logos without undergoing the labor of transformation. Nonlinear emergence describes a structure where the end precedes the middle, or where the origin directly initiates completion, and the transformation comes into view only afterward. This is the logic of visionary foreknowledge, of glimpsing the whole before walking the path. It's the domain of prophecy, archetype, and transcendent awareness. In this triad, the initiating factor 11, 2 directly reveals the moderating factor, 888. The Logos is glimpsed through revelation. The structure of triadic being is known before it is lived. This is the experience of epiphany, when a higher reality breaks into consciousness, unmediated by process. But the reacting factor, 6, 7, 0, still follows. The transformation from 6 to 7 to 0 is not negated, it is simply not the source of the vision. Instead, it is triggered by it. Once the end is seen, the soul is called to embody what it already knows. Here, 6, 7, 0 is a response, not a cause. This logic is central to mystical theology. The mystic does not build truth from experience, but receives the form whole, and then spends a lifetime living into its implications. The presence of the 888 at the beginning challenges the soul to pass through 6, 7, 0 in order to become what it already is. In the inclusion triad, each component builds on the previous, but the final element contains the prior to. This is the logic of synthesis. The third element isn't just a result, it is the reconciling totality. the place where the other two find completion. The initiating factor 11. 2 provides the foundation of distinction and logic. It gives us the tools to see, differentiate, and understand. The reacting factor 6, 7, 0 applies these tools within time and transformation, suffering, purification, surrender. But in inclusion, the moderating factor 888 becomes the container for both. It is not just a balance, it is the dwelling of opposition reconciled. In Christian terms, this is the kingdom, the new creation, the cosmic Christ who holds together all things in heaven and earth. This triad teaches that insight and transformation are ingredients, but only their union generates the true outcome. The 888 is not a return to its elements, it is something new, a third that enfolds the first two in perfected unity. Conjunction emphasizes a triadic relationship in which the middle term binds the extremes. It is the logic of sacrifice and mediation, the place where opposites meet and are joined. The reacting factor 670 plays the central role here. It is the place where order gives way to disruption, and finally to the mystery beyond form. This triad teaches that without reaction, insight cannot be realized and harmony cannot be born. The initiating factor 11, 2 and the moderating factor 888 represent polarities. The first is clarity through division, the second is integration beyond division. These cannot meet without the transitional process in between. In Christian terms, this is Christ as mediator, or the cross as the axis upon which heaven and earth are reconciled. The soul must enter the middle, the path of transformation, in order to hold both wisdom and peace. The conjunction triad is the structure of every sacrament, where form and spirit meet through an enacted rite. The harmonic triad describes a structure where any two components combine to produce the third. It is the logic of resonance and mutual implication, like the vibration of a string producing a chord when struck with another. This triad governs mutual dependency and co-creativity, where reality emerges through the interplay of opposites. In this logic, initiation and reaction, when brought together, meaning the perception of duality and the transformational sequence, give rise to the Logos. This reflects the structure of the Passion. The duality of divine and human is recognized, passed through the crucible of suffering and death, and in that union, the glorified Christ emerges. Conversely, initiation and moderation produce reaction. When someone perceives the whole while holding the logic of duality, transformation becomes inevitable. The soul must go through the process to embody what it knows. And when reaction and moderation come together, they generate new insight. Having passed through the transformation and having touched fullness, the soul returns to the world with new eyes, a deeper logic of reality, a transfigured duality. This triad confirms the interpenetration of spiritual elements. It implies that no spiritual process is isolated. Every movement of the soul is co-determined by what has gone before and what lies beyond. Harmony arises not from stasis, but from a living chord of relation. In the convergent triad, each element contains or implies both of the others. There is no sequence, no chain, rather each is a gateway into the whole. This is the logic of mystical simultaneity. To touch any aspect of the divine is to encounter the full structure of reality. The initiating factor in this triad is not merely the beginning of knowledge, but a compressed totality. The duality of 2 and the structure of 11 contain the blueprint of the full cycle. Insight, rightly seen, contains both process and harmony. The 6-7-0 sequence becomes the pattern in which both truth and peace unfold. Transformation cannot occur unless it is based on structure, and cannot conclude unless it is drawn toward integration. Every stage of reaction reflects and pulls from the initiating logic and the final harmony. And 888, often thought of as the end, is now understood as a living source. It is the presence of the Logos in every part of the journey. To experience 888 is to simultaneously initiate and transform. This echoes the Christ who is both Alpha and Omega, beginning and end, who contains within himself both the oppositions and their reconciliation. The triad of convergence reveals that the three elements are not 3 steps, but three faces of the same reality, each capable of opening the soul to the full movement. It is the logic behind contemplative insight, where a single gesture, an act of love, a moment of surrender, reveals the structure of the whole. Combination introduces exclusivity and inclusion at once through a paradoxical logic. Any two elements imply the negation of the third, but also call it into being through that negation. This is the logic of the dialectic, of tension and resolution, of synthesis born from conflict. In this triad, initiation and reaction, when held together, seem to exclude harmony. The contrast and the suffering may feel irreconcilable. Yet precisely through that opposition, the moderating factor is generated. The logos does not emerge from peace, but from the friction of opposites. When reaction and moderation are paired, they seem to exclude structure. Transformation tends to dissolve, and harmony to smooth over distinctions. Yet this loss is what compels the soul to rebuild its insight, to re-enter the logic of the two and rediscover the 11. And when initiation and moderation are present without transformation, the system appears static, self-satisfied, resistant to change. Yet it is from this exclusion that the need for a real process reasserts itself. This triad mirrors the rhythm of the Christian drama. Betrayal and suffering, initiation plus reaction, force the emergence of salvation, moderation. Likewise, resurrection without crucifixion becomes ungrounded, and law without mercy becomes dead. True unity arises through this creative contradiction. The association triad reflects a structure where any two elements require the presence of the third in order to stabilize their union. No pair is self-sufficient. The triad becomes a mutual affirmation where the missing third element is implicitly needed for the other two to cohere. If one holds initiation and reaction together, perception and transformation, this partnership demands a regulating logos. Without it, the system spirals into chaos without a center to hold it. The presence of the logos is what allows process and polarity to generate meaning rather than suffering. Likewise, reaction and moderation must be grounded in insight. Without the original perception of duality and structure, transformation becomes blind and harmony becomes unrooted. The initiating factor restores depth and coherence, and initiation and moderation, the clarity of distinction and the fullness of unity, only maintain their balance through transformation. Without reaction, there is no movement, no actualization, no reconciliation. The logos becomes a concept, not a lived reality. Association is the logic of relational necessity. It governs the inner structure of prayer, sacrament, and communal life, where the word and the spirit must be joined through the body and time to become real. Integration is the most complete of the triads. It asserts that the third element is produced only when the other two are joined. This is the logic of incarnation, of union, of fruitfulness. The third is not implied or presupposed, but generated through the union of the others. In this structure, the initiating factor, the vision of differentiation and logic, must be brought into real engagement with the reacting sequence, the crucible of experience and transformation. Only their union creates the moderating factor symbolized by 8 and 88, the logos made flesh, peace born through tension, harmony made real. This is not symbolic, it is the foundational structure of the Christian mystery. The divine word, 11, enters into the duality of creation, descends through suffering and death, and is raised into new life. Not as a return, but as a new synthesis, one that includes both time and eternity. Integration teaches that the logos is not an abstract perfection, but the fruit of a process. It is not the origin alone, nor the end in isolation, but the unbreakable union of both through the middle path. The Christ is not only the Alpha or the Omega, but the and between them. This triad reveals the final structural truth. Salvation, gnosis, divinization, all are integrated states, arising when wisdom passes through fire and emerges as light. Integration is not resolution by escape, but unity through endurance. These 11 triads form the affirmed logic of the Christian mystery, not 11 separate systems, but 11 angles on a single underlying reality. Each triad reveals how the initiating, reacting, and moderating elements read through the numerical and symbolic forms of 11 and 2, 6, 7, 0, and 8888, combine in different ways to describe the movement of spirit through time, form, and return. They map the conditions under which meaning becomes truth, and under which mystery becomes manifestation. From here, the path leads into the negations, the inversions, refusals, and distortions of these triads. For just as Logos has form, so too does its counterfeit. And it is only by understanding the negations that the triads are fully secured, not as possibilities, but as necessary conditions for divine life. If the affirmed triads reveal the logics of integration, then the negated triads expose the logics of distortion, disintegration, and falsification. These are not simply the absence of the truth, but active inversions of the structural order revealed by the affirmations. They are the patterns by which truth is broken, misread, or imitated without substance. In the same way that light casts shadow, every structure capable of supporting divine integration is also capable of being misaligned, producing not clarity, but confusion, not harmony, but fragmentation. The negated triads are essential not because they offer a separate system, but because they illuminate what happens when the true system is violated at a structural level. This is why their understanding cannot be reduced to the opposite of the good. In many cases, negation does not appear as absence, but as counterfeit presence. It mimics form, but without coherence. The soul, the tradition, the world may fall into these patterns while believing they remain within the truth. Recognizing the structure of negation allows one to discern false unities, unstable transformations, and partial truths presented as wholes. As with the affirmed triads, we interpret each negated triad in terms of the initiating factor, 218 as 11 and 2, the reacting factor, 6, 7, 0, and the moderating factor, 888. But in this case, each is misunderstood, misapplied, or excluded, not necessarily in name, but in function. These inversions often masquerade as completion, insight, or transformation, yet fail to bring forth integration. The equilibrium triad describes what happens when all three functions, initiating, reacting, and moderating, are absent, and their absence mirrors and reinforces itself. That is, not only is insight 11, 2 lacking, but the lack of insight appears normal. Not only is transformation, 6, 7, 0, avoided, but its absence is treated as stability. Not only is wholeness 888 missing, but the system proceeds as if it were already whole. This is not chaos, it is false stillness. The world, the tradition, or the soul in this state has no conflict because it has no contact with truth. It becomes sealed. Nothing enters or exits. Everything appears calm, complete, and unquestioned. The initiating factor is denied not through argument, but by never engaging duality at all. The reflective nature of 2 is erased, leaving only unexamined unity. The tension that births wisdom never arises. Likewise, the logic of 11, the entire grammar of triadic structure, is suppressed. The soul cannot recognize its own questions, so it does not ask them. The reacting factor, 6, 7, 0, is stifled entirely. The structure, a 6, remains unchallenged. The potential for transcendence, 7, never stirs. The void, 0, is not entered because it is never perceived. There is no movement, no risk, no surrender. The system survives by self-preserving inertia. The moderating factor, 888, is replaced by a false fullness. It becomes a simulacrum of harmony, what Paul might call a form of godliness, but denying its power. It appears complete, but is hollow. This is the logic of spiritually stagnant systems, communities, doctrines, or persons that have constructed a stable image of themselves precisely by removing the dynamism of divine interaction. Nothing is allowed to disturb the equilibrium because any challenge reveals the emptiness beneath the surface. The lesson of 1N is not that stillness is bad, but that stillness without insight, transformation, or harmony is not stillness at all, it is spiritual anesthesia. The absence of movement in this case is not peace but systemic blindness. Where the affirmed version of this triad, 2A, presents a reinforcing cycle of growth, its negation shows a locked system of mutual invalidation. If transformation fails, then insight is lost. If harmony disappears, then transformation becomes impossible. Each element falls backward, undoing what was previously possible. The initiating factor 11. 2 here is not simply absent, it becomes false clarity, an illusion of structure. Duality, 2, may still be invoked. Us versus them, right versus wrong, but without reflection or logic. Instead of generating awareness, it generates dogmatism or polarized delusion. The grammar of triadic reasoning, 11, is rejected in favor of binary thinking, which reinforces the collapse of nuance. The reacting factor, 670, becomes frozen. When insight is invalidated, transformation becomes either superficial ritual or chronic deconstruction with no telos. The process halts midstream, never rising from 6 to 7 or never letting go into 0. The soul resists change because it fears losing the false clarity it still clings to. The moderating factor, 888 in this context, becomes misused transcendence. It is an ideal held above the world, unearned and unreachable. The logos is invoked not as presence but as abstraction, an idol of wholeness rather than its embodiment. The system becomes one where every part invalidates the others. Insight tries to arise but is choked off by resistance to change. Change tries to occur but cannot reach depth without clarity. Harmony is spoken of but never embodied because it cannot root in anything true. This triad is visible in cycles of personal or cultural despair, repeated efforts to grow, think, or heal that collapse inward because the underlying functions reject each other. It is not a lack of effort, it is a structural contradiction where no part can support the others. Reversion describes a deceptive logic in which the process appears to be progressing toward integration, but actually retreats into illusion. It is the logic of idealized regression. The soul or system moves forward only to circle back into the comfort of undisturbed beginnings. Here, the moderating factor, 888, is claimed prematurely. The logos is declared present before duality is understood, 2, or transformation endured, 670. The symbol of wholeness is used to suppress process rather than fulfill it. The reacting factor becomes shallow or distorted. The passage from 6 to 7 may begin, but instead of surrendering into 0, the soul doubles back, preferring the security of 6 to the unknown void. The journey remains unfinished, but masked as completion. The initiating factor 11, 2 is falsified by nostalgia. Instead of entering into the true grammar of duality and differentiation, the mind seeks to return to simplicity, to childlike literalism or utopian ideology. The complexity of 11 is too much. The tension of 2 is denied. What remains is mythic memory without critical depth. Reversion appears safe, even sacred. It is the logic of returning to tradition without understanding the structure that gave tradition its vitality. It is the logic of spiritual platitudes used to evade suffering. It is the abuse of the logos, not as transformative word, but as a static image used to justify immobility. This triad reveals that movement toward God cannot occur without the willingness to pass through unmaking. To claim fullness without passing through the structure and the fire is to invert the very path that leads to life. Retrospective negation occurs when the loss of the end state, integration, causes a backward collapse, where meaning is not only lost, but undone in reverse. This is not forgetting the goal, but discrediting it entirely, which then unravels both process and insight. The moderating factor, 888, the vision of the harmonized logos, is rejected, either subtly, as unreachable or irrelevant, or overtly, as false or naive. When the soul no longer believes in real integration, the transformational path becomes disoriented. The process, 670, loses direction, becoming chaotic or despairing. There is suffering, but no telos. Disruption, 7, becomes crisis without passage. Dissolution, 0, becomes meaninglessness instead of release. This backward motion also corrupts the initiating factor. The recognition of duality, 2, and the grammar of triadic logic, 11, are retroactively denied. The soul may retreat into either flat materialism, denying spiritual structure altogether, or false simplicity, where duality is perceived only in crude oppositions, not in meaningful distinction. Either way, the system is now governed by loss of faith in resolution. This triad manifests in post-ideological despair, deconstructionism without reformation, and psychological nihilism. It is found wherever the loss of a credible logos results in the withdrawal of participation from transformation and understanding alike. This is the inner logic of despair, not sadness, but the belief that integration was never real to begin with. Exclusive negation is the logic of fragmentation masquerading as purity. It arises when two elements are removed and the remaining one is treated as the whole. The system now functions on exclusion, where each aspect invalidates the presence of the others. When initiation and transformation are rejected, only the illusion of harmony remains. The 888 becomes an idealized abstraction, unity with no structure and no process. This is the language of cosmic love, oneness, or universal truth without grounding. It produces spiritual bypass, false transcendence, and utopian speech divorced from reality. When transformation and harmony are excluded, only initiation remains, but now corrupted. The duality of two becomes aggressive opposition. Us versus them, light versus dark, truth versus lies. The logic of 11 collapses into a weaponized polarity, disconnected from movement or synthesis. When initiation and harmony are missing, only transformation remains. The soul embraces endless deconstruction, crisis, and flux. Suffering is fetishized. Disruption becomes identity. This is spiritual chaos masked as authenticity. This triad reveals the logic behind sectarianism, elitism, and doctrinal purism. It governs institutions, ideologies, or individuals who validate their identity through negation of others, claiming truth by excluding process and wholeness, or wholeness by denying structure and path. The result is spiritual isolation, built on fragmentation and illusion. In this structure, the absence of initiation and moderation prevents transformation from occurring at all. This is not collapse by destruction, but stagnation through compression. The system is closed from both ends. There is neither clear insight, 2118-11-2, nor real integration, 8888. So transformation is choked off, unable to begin or conclude. The initiating factor is absent or silenced. Duality is not perceived, or worse, is denied as divisive. There is no entry point into structured awareness. The symbolic language of 2 becomes suspect, and the logic of 11 with its system of affirmed triads is dismissed as overly analytical or unnecessary. Without structure, process has no direction. The moderating factor, similarly, is removed or rendered unknowable. The logos is rejected not from disbelief, but from disconnection. The soul cannot see what it is becoming, so it cannot move toward it. As a result, the reacting factor becomes bottled pressure. The cycle of 6, 7, 0 is unable to release. Structure, 6, becomes rigid. Disruption, 7, is feared. The void, 0, is treated as annihilation. Transformation thus becomes anxiety, not evolution. This triad appears in systems marked by suppressed growth, cultures, ideologies, or psyches that cannot accommodate change, yet cannot endure their own inertia. Reformation is demanded but resisted. Transformation is desired but blocked. The soul becomes like a sealed vessel under heat. Without the breath of insight or the vision of fulfillment, it cannot open. It either explodes or calcifies. Dissonance is the collapse of coherence through structural misalignment. In this triad, the absence of one component destabilizes the others, and each element, instead of cooperating, actively degrades the others. The whole becomes a field of interference rather than emergence. If harmony, 888, is lost, the system turns against itself. Initiation becomes endless polarity without direction, and transformation becomes disorganized suffering. The absence of logos generates confusion, not inquiry. If transformation, 670, is lost, initiation becomes brittle ideology, and harmony becomes static idealism. There is thought and image, but no movement between them. The system becomes dual but dead, rich in form, poor in life. If initiation 11, 2 is lost, transformation loses its framing, and harmony becomes vague. The soul may feel deeply, change often, or claim peace, but without differentiation, nothing holds. Feeling becomes noise, integration becomes illusion. Dissonant systems exhibit unresolvable contradiction. They are not simply incoherent, but structurally self-undermining. Each effort to grow or understand feeds confusion or collapse. The more energy is applied, the more fragmented the system becomes. This triad governs moments of spiritual schizophrenia, where conflicting truths are asserted without reconciliation, where opposites are neither held nor resolved, and where the structure of truth has collapsed into incoherent simultaneity. Divergence is the logic of disintegration through multiplicity. When any two elements are lost, the third cannot survive. The remaining aspect, no matter how strong, is not self-sustaining, because the triadic foundation has been destroyed. If initiation and harmony are removed, only transformation remains, but it becomes endless chaos, change without purpose, crisis without vision. The soul enters loops of experience, trauma or reinvention, but without orientation. It cannot interpret what is happening, nor integrate what has passed. If initiation and transformation are absent, only harmony remains. But now as false peace, an unearned stillness that denies conflict. This is the dream of balance with no friction, a spiritual flatland where wholeness is claimed but never built. If transformation and harmony are gone, only initiation remains. The mind clings to clarity and separation. Duality becomes a fortress. The world is seen in binaries, logic becomes hard-edged, and no process enters to soften or unify. Divergence often arises in systems that have specialized excessively, favoring one function while letting the others decay. It is common in fractured theologies, unbalanced personalities, or ideologies that elevate one mode of perception to the exclusion of all others. This triad teaches that no part of the mystery can be sustained in isolation. The truth is not in the elements, but in their structure of interdependence. Division describes the logic where two absences create a false whole. When two elements are missing, the third appears more powerful than it is, filling the void, but without the necessary supports. The result is a fragile supremacy, a part acting as if it were the whole. For instance, if initiation and transformation are missing, the only remaining element is harmony. But harmony, ungrounded and unearned, becomes spiritual absolutism, a totalizing vision of peace, love, or unity that rejects structure and process. It becomes an idol of completion, a counterfeit logos. If transformation and harmony are missing, only initiation remains. Structure is worshipped. Duality becomes law. This is the logic of legalism, orthodoxy as ideology, or purity culture, where the map is mistaken for the journey and the grammar of truth becomes a system of control. If initiation and harmony are absent, only transformation remains. This is the cult of experience, endless movement, intensity, disruption. The soul becomes an open wound, living always in the middle, never anchored or resolved. Division often masquerades as clarity. It presents a clean system, one strong aspect. But it collapses under strain because it lacks complementary support. It cannot sustain the weight of reality. Disassociation arises when transformation is lost, and its absence severs the connections between the remaining elements. Initiation and harmony may still appear, but they are cut off from each other, floating in parallel, unable to communicate. Without transformation, 670, the soul has no bridge between structure and integration. The logic of duality, 2, and the vision of wholeness, 888, exist in abstraction, with no process to unite them. The result is a split psyche, a disembodied theology, or a hollow mysticism. Initiation becomes disconnected thought, correct but sterile. Harmony becomes distant beauty, unreachable and idealized. The system cannot embody the truth it perceives. It lives in theory, in vision or in hope, but not in transformation. This triad governs many forms of modern spiritual paralysis, where the soul knows, perhaps deeply, what is true, but cannot actualize it. The missing middle, the fire of transformation, is the only thing that could integrate thought and vision. The final negated triad is disintegration, the total collapse of triadic structure. When transformation is lost, both initiation and moderation fall apart, and the system returns to undifferentiated fragmentation. Insight and harmony are no longer coherent. They do not support one another because the connecting logic has died. Disintegration appears not as crisis but as numbness. Truth is acknowledged but not inhabited. Beauty is glimpsed but not carried. Suffering is everywhere but does not open anything. The system has lost the capacity to transform. Its elements cannot move, combine or regenerate. This triad rules the end stage of spiritual failure. Not dramatic fall, but quiet despair. The soul becomes an echo chamber. Everything resonates, nothing changes. This is the place where religion becomes habit, mysticism becomes fantasy, and insight becomes memory. And yet paradoxically, disintegration is not the end. In its brokenness, it reveals the necessity of the true structure. The recognition that nothing works can become the first moment of return, if it is allowed to collapse fully. This is the 0 in 6, 7, 0, when nothing holds, but everything is possible. As we descend through the layers of Christian mystery, narrative, symbolic, and structural, we find that each layer does not discard the one before it, but deepens it. The narrative level offers the story, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. The semantic level reveals that these are not merely historical events, but archetypal symbols, mirrors for the soul and the cosmos. The syntactic level, finally, shows that beneath these symbols lies a grammar of being itself, the architecture by which the divine manifests, the soul transforms, and reality coheres. The name IESOUS, when properly read, contains all three levels in perfect compression. At the narrative level, it is the name of the Christ, the one in whom God enters history. At the symbolic level, each letter speaks of identity, life, wisdom, embodiment, transcendence, and return. But it is only at the structural level that the name becomes a functional pattern, a living equation of initiation, transformation, and integration, bound by a triadic logic that is neither arbitrary nor aesthetic, but necessary. The numerical value of IESOUS, 888, does not merely symbolize Christic perfection, it encodes the structural condition for spiritual wholeness. Split into two triads, IES and OUS, we uncover an underlying progression, a movement from differentiation, 11, and duality, 2, through process and disruption, 6, 7, 0, into restored and magnified balance, 888. Each of the affirmed triadic logics shows a different form of interaction between these three aspects, some simultaneous, some sequential, some convergent, some harmonic. And each of the negated triads shows what happens when that structure is twisted, resisted, or misunderstood. By understanding these patterns, we come to see that the Christian story is not only about a man, or even a symbol. It is about a system of reality in which the name IESOUS operates as a syntactic operator, binding structure, initiating, process, reacting, and integration, moderating, into a single, coherent expression of divine life. The name is not just what we call the Christ, it is what calls forth the Christic pattern within the world and the self. This understanding clarifies the narrative. The Gospels do not merely describe a sequence of events, but enact the passage from duality through transformation to resurrection. It enriches the semantic. The symbols of water, blood, bread, cross, and tomb are not floating metaphors, but fixed points in a logical system of conversion and return. And it unlocks the syntactic, the realization that reality itself is structured by triadic movement, and that salvation is not an exception to nature, but its fulfillment. When we read scripture, theology, or spiritual experience through these layered lenses, the name IESOUS ceases to be a word of faith alone. It becomes the organizing principle of meaning, the pattern by which God speaks, creation responds, and integration is made possible. It is in this deep structural sense that the name is above every name, not as rank, but as pattern that sustains all patterns, logos that governs all speech, and synthesis that draws all things into one. Thus, to understand the name IESOUS is to see how the divine reality becomes legible, not only in texts or doctrines, but in the very structure of existence. And to live by that name is not merely to believe in Christ, but to become coherent within the Christic pattern, to initiate in clarity, transform in suffering, and return in balance. This is the mystery made known, not in concealment, but in form. A system of interpretation is always tempted to absolutize its own tools. Those trained in narrative will insist that meaning must remain historical and concrete. Those trained in symbol will insist that meaning must remain fluid and manifold. Those trained in structure will insist that meaning must remain formal and necessary. The danger is not that any one of these modes is false, but that the mind, seeking security, will attempt to make one mode sufficient. In doing so, it mistakes a lens for a world. The method of this work has been to refuse that mistake. It has treated the Christian mysteries as irreducibly layered, and it has treated the name IESOUS as a disciplined invitation to move through those layers rather than to camp within one of them. The symbolic reductions of 2 and 18 into 11 and 2 awaken recognition, the intuition that reality is not exhausted by duality, and that the reconciliation of duality requires a third term, an order of relation that cannot be forced by will or solved by opposition alone. The structural sequence, 6 to 7-0, then withdraws the comfort of mere recognition and places the reader inside a process: stability, disruption, release. Here, number ceases to be ornament and becomes operator. Finally, the return to 888 restores the horizon that structure by itself cannot supply. Not an abstract endpoint, but a lived coherence, what theology calls logos, what metaphysics calls integration, what prayer calls the faithfulness of God. And so, if the triads described are indeed a complete set within the constraints we have named, then they do not merely offer interpretations. They describe the space in which interpretation must occur. Yet even a complete grammar does not explain why meaning is possible at all, why pattern persists across time, why transformation can be undergone without dissolving into noise, or why integration is more than a momentary illusion. The triads can map the conditions under which coherence is obtained, but they cannot manufacture coherence by description alone. They can show how the elements must relate. They cannot, by logic alone, guarantee that relation will hold. This is not a failure of reason. It is an acknowledgement of what every serious system eventually confesses, that it rests upon invariances it cannot generate from within itself. In our reading, the number 888 names that invariance. It signifies not a solved equation, but the very possibility that equations remain recognizable, that differences do not annihilate meaning, that transformation does not end in meaninglessness, that the world is not finally a scatter of unrelated events. Whether one speaks of God or of the fabric of reality, or of the logos by which all things cohere, the function is the same. Coherence is not merely a concept we entertain. It is the condition that permits concepts, symbols, histories, and structures to remain communicable. Faith, then, is not introduced as an excuse where demonstration runs out. It appears as the final honesty of the method. After symbol has awakened the mind, after structure has disciplined it, narrative returns to remind us that coherence is not only inferred but encountered, through persons, through suffering, through moral demand, through sacrament, through the stubborn persistence of meaning when it should have vanished. The name IESOUS becomes, in this sense, not a proof but a pattern, a compression of insight, process, and integration that can be known, enacted, and lived. In your own life too, remember that the refusal to move between interpretive regimes is itself a distortion. The mysteries do not yield to a single faculty, because the human being does not become whole through a single faculty. The name trains the reader to pass from recognition into transformation and back into coherence, until meaning is no longer something one argues for, but something one inhabits. What we call the Logos is the name we give to that coherence, at once the measure of the triads and the mercy that holds them together.